Dr. Elena Vasquez stepped off the transport shuttle onto the gleaming metal platform of Station Kepler 442b, her worn leather satchel bouncing against her hip with each step. The artificial gravity felt heavier than Earth's, making her boots ring against the deck plating with unusual force. Around her, the station hummed with the quiet efficiency of advanced alien technology, all smooth curves and surfaces that seemed to glow with their own inner light. The Zephyrian delegation was already waiting in the main conference hall, their tall, graceful forms arranged around a crystalline table that floated 3 feet above the floor without any visible support. Elena had studied their species extensively during the 6-month journey here, but seeing them in person still took her breath away. They stood nearly 8 feet tall, with skin that shifted between silver and blue depending on the angle of the light. Their large, oval eyes held an intelligence that seemed ancient beyond measure. Dr. Vasquez, the lead delegate, spoke, his voice carrying the musical quality that all Zephyrians possessed. "I am Scholar Thex Morvain, primary researcher of Xenocultural Studies at the Grand Academy of Zephyria Prime. We have been eagerly awaiting your arrival." Elena smiled and extended her hand in the human gesture of greeting she had been told they understood. The scholar looked at her outstretched palm for a moment before carefully touching it with 2 of his 6 fingers. His skin felt cool and slightly rough, like touching fine sandpaper. "The honor is mine, Scholar Thex Morvain," Elena replied, doing her best to pronounce the complex name correctly. "I'm excited to begin our cultural exchange program." The scholar's large eyes seemed to brighten at her words. "Yes, the exchange. Your species' request for mutual understanding has been approved by our Council of Minds. We are particularly interested in your written works, as they may provide insight into human thought patterns and social structures." Elena nodded enthusiastically. Literature had always been her passion, and the chance to share human stories with an alien civilization was the opportunity of a lifetime. She had brought with her a carefully selected collection of humanity's greatest works, from ancient epics to modern novels, all translated into the Zephyrian language using their most advanced translation matrices. "I've brought samples of our finest literature," she said, patting her satchel. "Everything from Shakespeare to contemporary science fiction. I think you'll find human storytelling quite fascinating." Scholar Thex Morvain's head tilted in what she had learned was a gesture of polite interest among his people. "We shall see. Our initial scans of your written materials have been puzzling. But we are patient beings, and understanding often comes through careful study." The other Zephyrians in the delegation remained silent, but Elena could sense their attention focused on the conversation. She had been briefed that Zephyrian society was highly hierarchical, with scholars holding positions of great respect. As the primary researcher, Thex Morvain would be the one making most of the decisions about their cultural exchange. "Perhaps we could start with something simple?" Elena suggested. "I brought a collection of human folktales and fairy tales. Stories that have been passed down through generations, representing the fundamental values and fears of our species." "An excellent beginning point," the scholar agreed. His skin shifted toward a deeper blue, which she had learned indicated pleased anticipation. "Shall we adjourn to the study chamber?" The study chamber turned out to be a vast room with walls that appeared to be made of living crystal. Soft light emanated from every surface, creating an environment that was bright but never harsh on the eyes. In the center of the room stood a reading platform that could adjust its height and angle to accommodate beings of different sizes and anatomies. Elena carefully removed a bound volume from her satchel and placed it on the platform. The book was one of her favorites, a collection of Grimm's fairy tales that she had personally translated and annotated for this exchange. The binding was traditional human leather and paper, chosen specifically to give the Zephyrians a sense of how humans created and preserved their stories. Scholar Thex Morvain approached the platform with the reverent care of someone approaching a holy relic. His 6-fingered hands hovered over the book's surface for a moment before making contact. Elena watched as his large eyes began to scan the pages, his expression growing more confused with each passing moment. After several minutes of silent reading, the scholar's skin began to shift toward a reddish hue that Elena recognized as indicating frustration or distress. He looked up from the book, his ancient eyes meeting hers with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Dr. Vasquez," he said slowly, "I must confess that I find this writing to be completely unreadable. The symbols appear to be arranged in patterns that make no logical sense. The narrative structure seems to begin at what should clearly be the ending, and the character development appears to progress backwards through time." Elena felt a cold shock of confusion run through her. The translation matrices had been checked and double-checked by the best linguists on Earth. There should have been no communication barriers with written language. "I'm sorry, scholar," she said carefully. "Could you describe exactly what you're seeing?" The translation should have rendered the text in perfect Zephyrian script. The scholar gestured toward the open book with obvious frustration. The very first line speaks of characters living happily ever after, which should clearly be a conclusion. Yet this appears at the beginning of the text. Then, the story proceeds to describe increasingly dire circumstances, ending with the introduction of the main characters in what appears to be a state of misery or conflict. Elena stared at the scholar for a moment, then at the book, then back at the scholar. A terrible suspicion was beginning to form in her mind. She stepped closer to the platform and looked down at how the scholar was holding the book. The binding was facing toward him. He was reading from back to front. "Scholar Thex Morvain," Elena said gently, trying to keep the amusement out of her voice, "you're holding it backwards." The scholar's large eyes blinked slowly, a gesture that Elena had learned indicated deep concentration among his people. "I beg your pardon?" "The book," Elena explained, reaching out carefully to indicate the orientation. "Human books are designed to be read from front to back, not back to front. The binding should be facing away from you, not toward you." For a long moment, Scholar Thex Morvain simply stared at her. Then, he looked down at the book in his hands. Then, back at her. Then, at the book again. His skin began to cycle rapidly through several colors, finally, settling on what Elena recognized as the Zephyrian equivalent of embarrassment. "You mean to say," he spoke slowly, "that your species reads in the opposite direction from what I assumed?" "Well," Elena said, trying to be diplomatic, "we read from left to right, top to bottom, and front to back. But, I understand that different species might have different conventions. How do Zephyrians typically read?" The scholar's embarrassment deepened, his skin now a deep purple that was almost black. "We read from right to left, bottom to top, and..." He paused, looking mortified. "And, back to front. I assumed, incorrectly it seems, that all intelligent species would naturally follow the same logical progression." Elena couldn't help herself. A small laugh escaped her lips, which she quickly tried to cover with a cough. But, the damage was done. The scholar's expression shifted to one of wounded pride. "I apologize," Elena said quickly. "I wasn't laughing at you, scholar. I was laughing at the situation. It's actually quite remarkable when you think about it. Here we are, two species that have mastered interstellar travel and communication, brought together across impossible distances, and we nearly failed to share a simple story because of which way we hold a book." The scholar considered this for a moment, his skin gradually returning to a more neutral silver blue. "You find this situation amusing rather than frustrating?" "Oh, definitely amusing," Elena confirmed. "In fact, I think it's rather wonderful. It shows how easy it is to make assumptions about other beings, even when we think we're being careful and thorough. We spent months perfecting the translation software, but nobody thought to check which direction the book should face." Scholar Thex Morvain was quiet for a long moment, his large eyes studying Elena's face with newfound interest. Finally, he spoke again. "Your reaction is unexpected. Most scholars in our experience would be irritated by such a fundamental misunderstanding. Yet you seem genuinely delighted by it." "That's because it tells us something important about both our species," Elena explained. "We both made the same assumption, just in opposite directions. We both believed our way was the natural way. And, we're both intelligent enough to recognize the error and adjust." The scholar carefully rotated the book 180 degrees, so that the binding now faced away from him. He opened it to what was now clearly the first page and began to read. Almost immediately, his skin brightened to a warm golden hue that Elena had learned indicated pleasure and interest. "Ah," he said after a few moments. "Now the narrative structure makes perfect sense. The characters are introduced in their initial state of conflict, they face challenges and grow, and they achieve resolution. This is indeed a logical progression. That's how humans tend to think about stories," Elena agreed. "We like to see characters overcome obstacles and change for the better. We call it a character arc." "Fascinating," the scholar murmured, his attention now fully absorbed in the text. "And, this particular story, about the young woman who loses her footwear at a formal gathering." "Cinderella," Elena supplied. It's one of our most popular fairy tales. Yes, Cinderella. The narrative structure suggests that individual worth is not determined by social status or material possessions, but by personal qualities such as kindness and perseverance. Is this a common theme in human literature? Elena nodded enthusiastically. Very common. Humans love underdog stories, tales where someone overcomes disadvantages through their own efforts and good character. We seem to have an instinctive sympathy for those who struggle against unfair circumstances. Scholar Thex Morvain looked up from the book with obvious surprise. This is remarkable. In Zephyrian literature, our most celebrated stories involve individuals who accept their place in the natural order and find fulfillment through conformity and service to the greater good. The idea of actively struggling against one's circumstances is quite alien to us. Really? Elena found this genuinely fascinating. So your heroes are people who work within the system rather than challenging it? Precisely. We admire those who understand their role in the cosmic harmony and fulfill it perfectly, regardless of personal desires or ambitions. A Zephyrian tale of someone like this Cinderella would focus on how she learned to find joy and meaning in her humble circumstances, not on her escape from them. Elena felt a thrill of excitement. This was exactly the kind of cultural insight that made the entire journey worthwhile. That's a fundamental difference in how our species view individual agency and social change. Humans tend to believe that circumstances should serve the individual, while Zephyrians believe the individual should serve the circumstances. An oversimplification, but not incorrect, the scholar agreed. Though I must admit, after reading this story, I find myself curious about the human perspective. There is something compelling about the idea that one can change one's fate through personal effort. Would you like to read more? Elena asked. I have stories that explore many different aspects of human nature and values. Some might seem strange to Zephyrian thinking, but they might also provide insights into why humans behave the way they do. The scholar's skin brightened further. I would be honored to continue. Though I must ask, are there any other orientation requirements I should know about? I would prefer not to make similar errors with additional texts. Elena grinned. Actually, now that you mention it, there are a few other conventions you might want to know about. Some human books are designed to be read in specific orders, some have multiple storylines that intersect, and some are meant to be read more than once to fully understand them. Oh, and some of our books have pictures that are just as important as the words. Scholar Thex Morvain's eyes widened with what Elena was beginning to recognize as scholarly excitement. Your species has created multiple formats and structures for written communication? This suggests a level of complexity in your information storage and retrieval systems that we had not anticipated. Human creativity tends to push against boundaries, Elena explained. We're always trying new ways to tell stories, new ways to share ideas, new ways to make people think or feel. Sometimes we succeed brilliantly, and sometimes we fail spectacularly, but we keep experimenting. And this experimentation is valued in your society? Generally, yes. We admire innovators and creators, people who come up with new ideas or new ways of doing things. We're not always good at accepting change when it happens, but we definitely celebrate the people who make it happen. The scholar was silent for a long moment, clearly processing this information. Finally, he spoke again. Dr. Vasquez, I believe this cultural exchange will be even more valuable than our Council of Minds anticipated. The differences between our species are far more fundamental than we realized, but also far more illuminating. I couldn't agree more, Elena said. And, I have to say, I'm looking forward to learning about Zephyrian literature as well. If your stories focus on harmony and acceptance, I suspect they might teach humans something important about finding peace and contentment. Perhaps, the scholar mused. Though I confess, after our conversation today, I find myself wondering if there might be times when struggling against circumstances is the appropriate response. Your species' perspective on individual agency is thought-provoking. Elena felt a warm glow of satisfaction. This was exactly what cultural exchange was supposed to accomplish, the opening of minds on both sides. I think we're going to learn a lot from each other, Scholar Thex Morvain. Indeed. Though I do hope that future misunderstandings will be as easily resolved as the backwards book incident. Oh, I wouldn't count on that, Elena laughed. Humans and Zephyrians are bound to find plenty of ways to confuse each other. But that's what makes it interesting, don't you think? If we understood everything about each other immediately, there wouldn't be much point in talking. The scholar's skin shifted to a warm amber color that Elena hadn't seen before. You know, Dr. Vasquez, I believe you may be quite right about that. Perhaps confusion and misunderstanding are not obstacles to communication, but rather opportunities for deeper learning. Now you're thinking like a human, Elena said with a smile. Is that good or bad? The scholar asked, and Elena was delighted to detect what sounded suspiciously like humor in his voice. That, she replied, is probably something we'll need to figure out together. 3 days after the backwards book incident, Scholar Thex Morvain summoned Elena to the station's central library, a vast chamber that seemed to exist in several dimensions at once. Crystalline shelves stretched impossibly high, filled with data crystals that glowed with soft, pulsing light. The air itself seemed to shimmer with stored information, and Elena could feel the weight of countless accumulated knowledge pressing down around her. Dr. Vasquez, the scholar greeted her, his skin displaying an unusual pattern of swirling colors that Elena hadn't seen before. I have spent the past 3 rotations studying the materials you provided, and I must confess that I am deeply troubled. Elena felt her stomach drop. Had she somehow offended Zephyrian's sensibilities? What's wrong, scholar? Did I include something inappropriate? Not inappropriate, no, Thex Morvain replied, his large eyes fixed on a data crystal he held in his primary hands. But profoundly disturbing nonetheless. I have been analyzing the patterns in your literature, and I have discovered something that challenges everything we thought we knew about human cognitive development. I'm not sure I understand, Elena said carefully, taking a seat on one of the floating chairs that materialized near her. The scholar activated the data crystal, and, suddenly, the air around them filled with holographic displays showing complex charts, graphs, and text analyses. Elena could see fragments of the story she had shared, broken down into component parts and reassembled in ways that made her feel slightly dizzy. According to our linguistic analysis protocols, the scholar began, your species' written works display a fundamental logical contradiction that should make coherent thought impossible. Yet clearly, humans are capable of advanced reasoning, technology, and interstellar communication. This paradox has consumed our research teams. Elena studied the floating displays, trying to make sense of what the scholar was showing her. The Zephyrian analysis seemed to focus on narrative structure, character motivation, and logical consistency in ways that felt alien to human literary criticism. Could you give me a specific example? She asked. I'm having trouble understanding what you see as contradictory. Thex Morvain manipulated the crystal, and the displays shifted to focus on a single story. Elena recognized it immediately as Romeo and Juliet, one of Shakespeare's most famous tragedies. This narrative, the scholar said, his skin darkening with what Elena now recognized as confusion and distress, presents characters who repeatedly make choices that any logical being would recognize as counterproductive to their stated goals. Yet the story treats these choices as noble and admirable. You mean Romeo and Juliet's decision to pursue their love despite their family's feud? Precisely. The scholar's agitation was clear in both his coloring and his voice. These two young beings claim to desire happiness and unity, yet they consistently choose actions that lead directly toward conflict and destruction. They could have simply relocated to a different planetary system where their family affiliations would be irrelevant. Instead, they remain in a situation that makes their goals impossible to achieve. Elena couldn't help but smile. Scholar, I think you're approaching human literature with Zephyrian logic. The point of Romeo and Juliet isn't that they make the most practical choices. The point is that they're willing to sacrifice everything for love. But that makes no sense whatsoever, Thex Morvain protested, his skin now cycling through rapid color changes. If they truly loved each other, they would choose the path most likely to ensure their continued survival and happiness. Their behavior is completely contradictory to their stated objectives. To a Zephyrian, maybe, Elena agreed. But humans don't always make logical choices. Sometimes we make emotional ones, even when we know they're not practical. Sometimes we value the gesture more than the outcome. The scholar stared at her with an expression that suggested she had just announced that humans could fly by flapping their arms vigorously. You're saying that your species deliberately chooses inferior solutions to problems? Not deliberately, exactly, Elena tried to explain. It's more that we sometimes have competing values. Logic and emotion, individual desires and social responsibilities, short-term happiness and long-term consequences. When these values conflict, different humans make different choices. But there must be optimal solutions, the scholar insisted. Mathematical analysis can determine the best possible outcome in any given situation. Why would your species ignore such analysis? Elena leaned back in her floating chair, trying to find a way to bridge the gap between human and Zephyrian thinking. Let me ask you something, scholar. In Zephyrian society, how are major decisions made? Through careful analysis of all available data, Fex Morvain replied immediately. Our computational matrices can process millions of variables to determine the course of action that will produce the greatest benefit for the greatest number of beings, with minimal disruption to cosmic harmony. And everyone accepts these decisions? Of course. Why would anyone choose a demonstrably inferior option when the superior option has been clearly identified? Elena nodded slowly. That's the difference. Humans don't always agree on what constitutes a superior option. What looks optimal from one perspective might look terrible from another. Romeo and Juliet valued their love more than they valued social harmony or personal safety. From their perspective, a life without love wasn't worth living, even if it was longer and more secure. The scholar was quiet for a long moment, his skin gradually settling into a deep blue that Elena associated with intense concentration. Finally, he spoke again. Are you suggesting that humans deliberately employ multiple, contradictory value systems simultaneously? Not deliberately, but, yes, I suppose we do. We value love and logic, freedom and security, individuality and community. Sometimes these values align, and sometimes they don't. When they conflict, we have to choose which one matters more in that specific situation. This is... Fex Morvain paused, searching for words. This is like trying to navigate using multiple star charts that point in different directions. How do you function as a society with such fundamental inconsistencies? Elena laughed, surprising herself with the sound echoing in the vast library. Not very well, sometimes. We have conflicts, disagreements, wars. But we also have incredible diversity of thought and innovation. Because we don't all think the same way, we come up with solutions that none of us would have found alone. The scholar manipulated his data crystal again, and the display shifted to show a different story. Elena recognized it as The Gift of the Magi, O. Henry's Christmas tale about a young couple who each sacrificed their most precious possession to buy a gift for the other. This narrative presents an even more baffling scenario, the scholar said. Two beings exchange gifts that render each other's sacrifices meaningless. The female cuts her hair to purchase an ornament for the male's timepiece, while simultaneously the male sells his timepiece to purchase ornaments for the female's hair. The end result is that both beings have lost their most valued possessions and gain nothing of practical value. But they've gained something else, Elena pointed out. They've learned how much they love each other. They've demonstrated their willingness to sacrifice for each other's happiness. Demonstrated to whom? The scholar asked. They already knew of their mutual affection. The demonstration served no informational purpose. Elena found herself struggling to explain something that seemed so fundamentally human that she had never really analyzed it before. The demonstration was for themselves, I think. Love isn't just a feeling, scholar. It's also a commitment, a choice you make over and over again. By showing that they were willing to sacrifice for each other, they were reinforcing their bond. But they could have simply verbally confirmed their mutual commitment, Fex Morvain protested. No sacrifice of material resources would have been necessary. Words are easy, Elena said. Actions are harder. When someone does something difficult or painful for your sake, it means more than when they just say nice things. The scholar's skin began to cycle through colors again, and Elena could practically see him trying to process this concept through Zephyrian logic. You're suggesting that the inefficiency of the action is precisely what gives it meaning? In a way, yes. If it were easy and logical, it wouldn't prove anything. The fact that it's costly and irrational is what makes it meaningful. This is... The scholar paused again, his large eyes blinking slowly. This is completely contrary to everything we understand about efficient resource allocation and optimal decision-making. I know, Elena said sympathetically. But it works for us. Maybe not efficiently, but it works. Fex Morvain was quiet for several minutes, his attention focused on the floating displays around them. Elena watched as he scrolled through analysis after analysis of human literature, each one apparently confirming his species' bewilderment at human behavior patterns. Dr. Vasquez, he said finally, I must ask you something that may seem insulting, but I require clarification for my research.
Go ahead, Elena said. I doubt anything you say could be worse than some of the literary criticism I've read. How does your species accomplish anything? If humans consistently make suboptimal choices based on emotional rather than logical criteria, how did you develop technology advanced enough for interstellar travel? How did you build cities, create art, establish governments, or master scientific principles? Elena considered the question seriously. It was, she realized, actually quite profound. I think the answer is that our illogical choices aren't always wrong, just different. When humans choose love over logic, sometimes we discover things that pure logic would never find. When we refuse to accept that optimal solution, sometimes we find better solutions that nobody had thought of before. Can you provide an example? Elena thought for a moment. Well, take space exploration. From a purely logical standpoint, spending enormous resources to send humans into space makes no sense. Robots can do the job more efficiently and safely. But humans wanted to go ourselves, to experience it directly, to take risks that no computer would approve. And, because we did that, we made discoveries and connections that we never would have made otherwise. Including this cultural exchange, the scholar pointed out. Exactly. A purely logical Zephyrian approach might have been to study human broadcasts from a safe distance and draw conclusions. But, instead, your people chose to meet us face to face, to risk misunderstanding and confusion in order to gain deeper knowledge. Thex Morvain's skin shifted to the warm golden hue that Elena associated with pleased understanding. You're suggesting that both logical and emotional approaches to decision-making have value? I'm suggesting that maybe they're not as different as they seem, Elena said. Zephyrians value harmony and optimal outcomes. But choosing to engage with humans, despite our obvious illogical tendencies, is itself a kind of emotional choice. You're valuing knowledge and understanding over safety and certainty. The scholar considered this for a long moment. You believe that our decision to pursue this cultural exchange was driven by curiosity rather than pure logic? Isn't it? Elena asked. Pure logic would suggest that contact with an unpredictable species carries unnecessary risks. But, you chose to do it anyway because you wanted to learn, to grow, to understand something new. That's not entirely different from Romeo and Juliet choosing love over safety. The silence that followed was longer this time. Elena watched as Thex Morvain's skin cycled through several colors she hadn't seen before, finally, settling on a deep purple that seemed to indicate deep thought or revelation. Dr. Vasquez, he said slowly, I believe you have identified a fundamental flaw in our analysis methodology. What do you mean? We have been attempting to understand human literature by applying pure Zephyrian logic to it. But, if human decision-making operates on different principles, then, our analytical framework is fundamentally inadequate for the task. Elena felt a surge of excitement. So what do you think we should do about it? The scholar's skin brightened considerably. I think, Dr. Vasquez, that I need to learn to think like a human. At least partially. At least enough to understand why your species finds value in inefficient but meaningful actions. That could be dangerous, Elena warned, though she was smiling as she said it. Human thinking has been known to cause symptoms like excessive risk-taking, irrational optimism, and spontaneous poetry composition. For the first time since she had met him, Scholar Thex Morvain made a sound that Elena was fairly certain was laughter. Dr. Vasquez, he said, I believe I am willing to accept those risks. A week into their collaboration, Elena arrived at the library to find Scholar Thex Morvain surrounded by floating holographic displays showing what appeared to be thousands of human literary works, all cross-referenced and analyzed in ways that made her head spin just looking at them. His skin was cycling through colors so rapidly that it was almost strobing, and his 6 hands were manipulating multiple data crystals simultaneously. Scholar? Elena called out cautiously. Are you all right? Thex Morvain looked up from his work, and Elena was startled to see that his large eyes appeared slightly unfocused. Dr. Vasquez. Perfect timing. I have been experimenting with human-style thinking, and I believe I have made a breakthrough, though I am not entirely certain it is a positive development. Elena moved closer, noting that the normally immaculate scholar appeared somewhat disheveled. His usually pristine robes were wrinkled, and there were what looked like food stains on the fabric. When was the last time you took a break? Break? The scholar looked confused by the concept. Why would I take a break when I am making such fascinating discoveries? Did you know that humans have created an entire literary genre devoted to stories where the primary characters are animals who behave like humans? And another genre where humans imagine themselves with supernatural abilities? And yet another where humans travel through time and change their own past? Fantasy and science fiction, yes, Elena said, beginning to feel concerned. Scholar, have you been here all night? All night?
I have been here for 3 rotations, Thexmore Vane replied, his skin now pulsing between bright yellow and deep red. I cannot seem to stop reading your literature. Each story leads to questions that require reading more stories to answer, which leads to more questions, which require more stories. It is like a cognitive loop that feeds back on itself indefinitely. Elena stared at him with dawning horror.
Oh no. Scholar, I think you've discovered what humans call falling down a rabbit hole. Rabbit hole?
The scholar looked around wildly. Where? I have not seen any rabbits, though I did read a fascinating story about a young human who follows a rabbit into an underground realm where logic appears to be completely suspended. That's Alice in Wonderland, Elena said, gently taking one of the data crystals from his hands.
And, yes, that's exactly what I mean.
You've become obsessed with human literature to the point where you're not taking care of yourself.
Obsessed? Thexmore Vane blinked several times in rapid succession. Is that the correct term? I was attempting to think like a human, as we discussed. I believe I may have been more successful than anticipated. Elena looked around at the chaos of literary analysis surrounding them. Scholar, this isn't healthy. Even humans take breaks from reading when they're doing research.
But, there is so much to understand, the scholar protested, reaching for another data crystal.
Did you know that humans have created stories where they imagine falling in love with beings from other species? And stories where they befriend their enemies? And stories where they sacrifice their lives for abstract concepts like honor or justice?
Yes, I know, Elena said patiently, moving the crystal out of his reach. But, you don't need to read all of human literature in 1 week. It took us thousands of years to create it. Thexmore Vane's skin suddenly shifted to a deep blue, and he sat down heavily on one of the floating chairs. Dr. Vasquez, I believe I am experiencing something that your literature would describe as an emotional crisis. Elena felt a pang of guilt.
What kind of crisis?
I have been attempting to understand human emotional logic by applying it to my own thoughts and experiences.
The results have been unsettling. The scholar's voice carried a tremor that Elena had never heard before.
I find myself questioning decisions that I have never questioned before, feeling dissatisfaction with circumstances that I have always accepted, and experiencing what I can only describe as a desire for experiences that logic tells me are unnecessary.
That sounds like you're becoming more human, Elena said gently. But that doesn't mean you have to abandon being Zephyrian. Doesn't it?
Thexmore Vane looked at her with an expression of profound confusion. Your literature suggests that authentic existence requires following one's emotional impulses rather than accepting logical constraints. But, my emotional impulses are increasingly in conflict with my logical responsibilities. Elena sat down in a chair across from the scholar, recognizing that they had reached a critical moment in their cultural exchange.
What kind of conflict?
The scholar was quiet for a long moment, his skin gradually settling into a muted silver. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Dr. Vasquez, for the first time in my existence, I find myself questioning whether the Zephyrian way of life is optimal. Your stories have shown me possibilities that I never imagined, ways of being that seem to offer experiences I have never had.
And yet
you're afraid that pursuing those experiences would mean betraying your people and your culture, Elena finished.
Precisely. Thexmore Vane's large eyes met hers, and she could see genuine anguish in them.
I have spent my entire life in service to the pursuit of knowledge and the maintenance of cosmic harmony. These goals have always seemed sufficient, logical, correct. But now I find myself wondering what it would be like to make an illogical choice, to pursue a personal desire regardless of its impact on the greater good.
Elena leaned forward. Scholar, can I ask what kind of personal desire you're talking about? The scholar's skin flushed deep purple with embarrassment.
It is difficult to articulate.
But I find myself curious about experiences that serve no logical purpose.
I want to know what it feels like to watch a sunrise for purely aesthetic reasons rather than as a method of marking time. I want to understand the sensation of creating something beautiful that serves no functional purpose.
I want to
know what it would be like to form an emotional bond with another being based on personal preference rather than optimal compatibility. Elena felt her heart go out to him.
Those aren't dangerous desires, scholar. They're just human ones.
But they are in direct conflict with Zephyrian values, Thex Morvain protested. If I pursue personal aesthetic experiences, I am diverting resources from more important activities. If I create non-functional beauty, I am wasting materials that could serve practical purposes. If I form emotional attachments based on personal preference, I am choosing suboptimal social arrangements. Elena was quiet for a moment, thinking carefully about how to respond.
Finally, she spoke. Scholar, can I share something with you? When I was young, I wanted to be a scientist like my parents.
They were both researchers, brilliant and logical and completely dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge. It would have been the optimal choice for me to follow their path.
But you chose literature instead, Thex Morvain observed.
I chose literature because I loved it, Elena confirmed. Because reading stories made me feel something that reading scientific papers never did. Because I wanted to understand how and why humans create meaning through narrative. My parents were disappointed, my professors thought I was wasting my potential, and I spent years wondering if I had made the wrong choice.
And now? Elena smiled. Now I'm here, sharing human stories with an alien civilization, helping to build understanding between species. If I had become a scientist, I would never have been qualified for this mission.
Sometimes the illogical choice turns out to be the right choice, even if you can't see it at the time.
Thex Morvain's skin shifted to a warmer tone. You believe that following personal desires can serve larger purposes?
I think personal desires and larger purposes aren't always in conflict, Elena said. Your desire to understand beauty, to create, to form personal connections, those aren't selfish impulses.
They're part of what makes a being fully alive. And a fully alive being contributes more to cosmic harmony, not less. But how can I reconcile this with my responsibilities to Zephyrian society? Elena leaned back in her chair, considering. Maybe the question isn't whether you should abandon Zephyrian values or embrace human ones. Maybe the question is whether you can find a way to honor both. I do not understand. Well, think about what you're doing right now, Elena pointed out.
You're pursuing knowledge, which is a core Zephyrian value. But you're pursuing it in a very human way, driven by curiosity and personal passion rather than systematic obligation. You're serving your people by learning about humans, but you're also satisfying your own desire to understand new ways of thinking.
Thex Morvain blinked slowly. You're suggesting that the pursuit of knowledge and the pursuit of personal fulfillment can be the same thing?
In your case, I think they already are, Elena said.
You're not abandoning your culture, scholar. You're expanding it.
The scholar sat quietly for several minutes, his skin cycling through subtle color changes as he processed this idea. Elena waited patiently, remembering her own struggles with similar questions when she was younger.
Dr. Vasquez, Thex Morvain said finally, I would like to try an experiment. What kind of experiment?
I would like to attempt to create something beautiful that serves no functional purpose, simply to understand what the experience feels like. But I would like to do it in collaboration with you, so that the creation itself becomes part of our cultural exchange and, thus serves the logical purpose of advancing interspecies understanding.
Elena felt a grin spreading across her face. Scholar, I think you might be getting the hang of human logic after all. Is that what I am doing? Finding a way to satisfy your personal desires while also fulfilling your responsibilities? Creating win-win solutions that honor multiple values simultaneously? Yes, that's exactly what you're doing. Humans do it all the time. Thex Morvain's skin brightened to a warm golden hue. Then, perhaps becoming more human does not require becoming less Zephyrian.
Maybe becoming more human just means becoming more yourself, Elena suggested.
After all, you're not trying to become a different person.
You're trying to become the fullest version of who you already are. The scholar stood up from his chair and moved to the central platform, his movements more energetic than Elena had seen since their first meeting. Dr. Vasquez, I have an idea for our collaborative creation.
What if we work together to create a new form of literature that combines human emotional narrative with Zephyrian logical structure? Elena felt a thrill of excitement. That sounds amazing. What did you have in mind?
Stories that demonstrate how emotional choices can lead to logical outcomes, Thexmorvain explained, his skin now glowing with enthusiasm. Narratives that show how personal desires and cosmic harmony can be aligned rather than in conflict. Literature that bridges the gap between our two ways of thinking.
Stories that prove love and logic aren't opposites, Elena added, understanding immediately what he was envisioning. Exactly.
The scholar's excitement was infectious. Stories that your species and mine could both understand and appreciate, that honor both human emotional truth and Zephyrian systematic thinking. Elena stood up as well, her mind already racing with possibilities. We could explore themes like how individual growth serves community development, or how seemingly irrational choices can lead to unexpected solutions. Or how the pursuit of beauty and meaning actually enhances rather than detracts from practical effectiveness, Thexmorvain added. Stories that demonstrate what you called win-win solutions. This could revolutionize literature for both our species, Elena said, feeling the kind of excitement that had originally drawn her to studying stories.
We could create something entirely new.
Thexmorvain paused, his skin shifting to a more thoughtful blue.
Dr. Vasquez, is this what humans call inspiration? Elena laughed.
Yes, scholar. I think it is. It is a remarkable sensation, the scholar mused. I feel as though my mind is generating possibilities faster than I can analyze them. It is highly inefficient, but, also. He paused, searching for words.
Also exhilarating. Welcome to the human experience, Elena said.
Inefficient but exhilarating is basically our species' motto. Then, perhaps, Thexmorvain said, his skin now radiating a warm, steady light, it is time for me to learn to be inefficiently exhilarating while remaining logically effective. Elena extended her hand toward the scholar, and, this time he grasped it firmly with all 6 of his fingers.
Partner, she said, I think we're going to create something wonderful.
Something beautiful and meaningful and completely unprecedented, the scholar agreed. Something that serves no practical purpose except to bridge the space between minds and hearts across the vast distances of space. In other words, Elena said with a grin, something perfectly, illogically human. And something perfectly, intuitively Zephyrian, Thexmorvain replied. The optimal solution disguised as an emotional choice. Or maybe, Elena suggested, an emotional choice that turns out to be optimal after all.
The scholar's skin brightened even further. Dr. Vasquez, I believe we are about to discover that the distinction between those two possibilities is far less important than we thought.
That, Elena said, sounds like the beginning of a very good story. 2 weeks later, Elena and Scholar Thexmorvain had transformed a section of the station's library into what could only be described as organized chaos. Holographic displays showed partial manuscripts floating in mid-air, data crystals lay scattered across every surface, and sheets of traditional paper covered with human handwriting were mixed with Zephyrian thought matrices in ways that would have horrified the station's information management systems. I believe we have created something unprecedented, Thexmorvain announced, his skin glowing with satisfaction as he gestured toward their latest collaborative story. A narrative that demonstrates how emotional decision-making can produce logical outcomes while simultaneously showing how logical analysis can validate emotional truths. Elena looked up from her notes, grinning at the scholar's obvious pride.
It's good, isn't it?
I never thought I'd see the day when someone could write a love story that included mathematical proofs. And I never imagined that mathematical proofs could be romantic, the scholar replied, his skin shifting to an amused amber tone. Though I must admit, demonstrating the statistical probability that two compatible beings will find optimal happiness together does have a certain aesthetic appeal. Their work had been progressing remarkably well. By combining human narrative techniques with Zephyrian analytical methods, they had created several stories that managed to satisfy both species' literary sensibilities. The tales featured characters who faced emotional dilemmas but solved them through careful reasoning and logical problems that required emotional insight to resolve.
Elena was about to respond when an alarm chime echoed through the library, followed by an announcement in the formal Zephyrian language.
Thexmorvain's skin immediately shifted to a dark, worried blue, and his posture became rigidly formal.
What is it? Elena asked, recognizing the change in the scholar's demeanor.
The High Council of Mines has arrived for an unscheduled inspection, Thexmorvain replied, his voice tight with tension. They wish to review the progress of our cultural exchange program.
Elena felt her stomach drop. Is that bad?
It is unexpected, the scholar said carefully. The High Council typically conducts reviews only when there are concerns about the efficiency or appropriateness of research projects.
Before Elena could ask for more details, the library's main entrance dilated to admit three of the most imposing Zephyrians Elena had ever seen.
They were taller than Thexmore Vane, with skin that seemed to shimmer between silver and black, and their large eyes held an intensity that made Elena feel like she was being examined under a microscope.
Scholar Thexmore Vane, the central figure, spoke, her voice carrying authority that made Elena instinctively straighten.
I am High Counselor Vex Nael Prime, Director of Xenocultural Efficiency Analysis. We have come to evaluate your research methods and determine whether this exchange program continues to serve optimal purposes.
Thexmore Vane's skin had gone completely silver, a color Elena associated with extreme formality. High Counselor, it is an honor to receive your attention. How may I assist your evaluation?
We have been monitoring your research outputs, High Counselor Vex Nael Prime replied, her large eyes scanning the chaos of their workspace with obvious disapproval.
Our analysis indicates significant deviation from standard xenocultural study protocols.
Your recent communications to the Grand Academy have contained language patterns that suggest possible cognitive contamination by human thought processes.
Elena felt a chill run down her spine.
The way the High Counselor spoke about contamination made it clear that she viewed human influence as a problem to be solved rather than a resource to be valued. I have been employing experimental methodologies to better understand human cognitive patterns, Thexmore Vane explained, his voice carefully neutral. These methods require temporary adoption of human-style thinking processes.
Temporary adoption?
One of the other counselors spoke for the first time, his skin displaying patterns that Elena didn't recognize.
Our analysis suggests that your cognitive patterns have shown persistent alteration over the past 2 weeks.
You have been observed engaging in non-functional aesthetic contemplation, creating purposeless artistic constructs, and exhibiting emotional responses inappropriate to your station. Elena realized with growing alarm that the Zephyrians had been monitoring not just Thexmore Vane's research, but his personal behavior. The desires he had confessed to her, his excitement about their collaborative work, his growing appreciation for human-style thinking, all of it had been noted and classified as problematic. High Counselor, Elena spoke up, knowing she was probably making the situation worse but unable to stay silent. Scholar Thexmore Vane has made remarkable progress in understanding human literature and culture. His insights have been invaluable to our exchange program. High Counselor Vex Nael Prime turned her attention to Elena, and the intensity of her gaze was almost overwhelming. Dr. Vasquez, our concern is precisely that the scholar has become too invested in understanding your species' suboptimal thought patterns. Effective xenocultural analysis requires objective distance, not emotional engagement.
But he hasn't lost his objectivity, Elena protested. He's expanded it. He can now analyze human behavior from both Zephyrian and human perspectives, which gives him insights that pure objectivity never could. Insights? The third counselor's skin flashed a color that Elena was fairly certain indicated disdain.
Or cognitive distortions that compromise his ability to provide accurate analysis? Elena looked at Thexmore Vane, hoping he would defend their work and his new way of thinking.
But the scholar remained silent, his skin locked in that formal silver tone that suggested he had completely shut down emotionally. Scholar Thexmore Vane, High Counselor Vex Nael Prime addressed him directly.
You will submit to immediate cognitive realignment procedures to restore optimal analytical functioning.
The Human Cultural Exchange Program will be suspended pending a full review of research protocols.
No. Elena stepped forward before she could stop herself. You can't just erase what he's learned. He's made genuine breakthroughs in understanding how different species can communicate and collaborate. Dr. Vasquez, the High Counselor's voice carried a warning.
You are a guest here. Do not presume to interfere with internal Zephyrian administrative procedures.
Elena felt her temper flare, all her diplomatic training forgotten in the face of what felt like a profound injustice.
This isn't administration, it's intellectual tyranny.
You're punishing Scholar Thexmore Vane for having the courage to truly understand another species instead of just cataloging their differences. The silence that followed was deafening. Elena could see Thexmore Vane's skin beginning to cycle through rapid color changes, and she realized that her outburst might have just made everything worse for him.
High Counselor Vex Nael Prime studied Elena with an expression that seemed to see right through her. You believe that the scholar's adoption of human thought patterns represents courage rather than contamination?
I believe it represents growth, Elena said, forcing herself to speak more calmly.
Learning to understand how others think doesn't weaken your own thinking. It strengthens it. Even when such understanding leads to behavior that serves no logical purpose? Elena thought about the question seriously. Especially then. Because sometimes behavior that seems illogical serves purposes that logic alone can't recognize.
The High Counselor was quiet for a long moment, her large eyes shifting between Elena and Thexmorvain.
Finally, she spoke again. Scholar, you have remained silent during this exchange. Do you agree with Dr. Vasquez's assessment of your cognitive changes? Thexmorvain's skin went through several color shifts before settling on a deep blue that Elena associated with careful thought.
When he spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. High Counselor, I believe that my ability to understand and analyze human culture has been significantly enhanced by my adoption of human cognitive patterns. However, I also recognize that such adoption has led me to question certain aspects of Zephyrian methodology.
And, do you view such questioning as beneficial or problematic?
The scholar was quiet for several seconds. Elena held her breath, knowing that his answer could determine not just the fate of their exchange program, but possibly his entire future within Zephyrian society. High Counselor, Thexmorvain said finally, I believe that questioning is always beneficial, even when it is uncomfortable.
Perhaps especially when it is uncomfortable. The reaction from the three counselors was immediate.
Their skin colors shifted to patterns Elena had never seen before, and she could sense their shock and disapproval even without understanding the specific meaning of their displays. Scholar Thexmorvain, High Counselor Vexanael Prime said, her voice carrying a note of what might have been disappointment, you have clearly been more severely affected by human cognitive patterns than our preliminary analysis indicated.
Immediate cognitive realignment is now mandatory rather than recommended.
Wait, Elena said desperately. Before you do anything irreversible, let me show you something.
Please.
The High Counselor's expression suggested she was rapidly losing patience.
Dr. Vasquez,
there is nothing you could show us that would change our assessment of the situation.
What if I could prove that Scholar Thexmorvain's new way of thinking produces better analytical results than traditional Zephyrian methods? Elena asked. Would that change your assessment?
That would be impossible, the third counselor interjected.
Zephyrian analytical methods have been refined over millennia to achieve optimal efficiency and accuracy.
Then, you should have no objection to a demonstration, Elena said, her heart pounding as she realized she was about to stake everything on an idea that might not work.
High Counselor Vexanael Prime studied Elena for a long moment.
Very well, Dr. Vasquez.
You have 5 minutes to present whatever evidence you believe supports your position.
However, failure to provide convincing proof will result in immediate termination of the exchange program and permanent restrictions on future human-Zephyrian contact. Elena swallowed hard, realizing she had just bet the entire future of interspecies relations on her faith in Thexmorvain's growth. But, as she looked at the scholar, she saw his skin shifting from silver to a warm, determined gold, and she knew she had made the right choice. Scholar, she said, show them what we've created together. Scholar Thexmorvain stepped forward, his skin glowing with a confidence that Elena had never seen from him before. With careful, deliberate movements, he activated the central display system and began loading their collaborative work. High Counselor Vexanael Prime, he said, his voice steady despite the enormous stakes, I would like to present our analysis of optimal conflict resolution strategies using hybrid Zephyrian human methodologies. The holographic displays filled with their latest creation, a story about two spacefaring civilizations attempting to negotiate a trade agreement despite fundamental differences in their approaches to commerce and resource allocation. But, unlike traditional human literature or Zephyrian analysis, this narrative combined emotional character development with mathematical optimization theory.
This narrative, Thexmorvain began, presents characters who face a logical problem that cannot be solved through pure rational analysis alone.
The crystalline collective values efficiency and resource optimization above all else, while the wandering clans prioritize individual freedom and cultural preservation.
Traditional negotiation protocols fail because each side defines optimal outcome differently. High Counselor Vexanael Prime studied the displays with obvious skepticism.
This appears to be a standard diplomatic scenario.
How does your hybrid methodology produce superior analysis?
Observe the solution process, the scholar replied, manipulating the displays to highlight specific sections.
Pure Zephyrian analysis would recommend that one side adopt the other's value system for maximum efficiency.
pure human analysis would focus on emotional compromise and mutual understanding. But our hybrid approach reveals a third option.
Elena watched as Thex Morvain walked the counselors through their story step by step.
In their narrative, the negotiating characters discovered that the Crystal and Collective's obsession with efficiency had actually made them less efficient in certain areas, while the Wandering Clan's focus on individual freedom had created unexpected opportunities for resource optimization. The solution, the scholar explained, emerges when both sides recognize that their supposedly contradictory values actually complement each other. The Collective's efficiency expertise helps the clans preserve their culture more effectively, while the clan's individual creativity helps the Collective optimize their resource allocation in ways they had never considered.
This is still just theoretical narrative, the second counselor objected. How does it demonstrate superior analytical capability? Thex Morvain's skin brightened with enthusiasm.
Because we tested it, High Counselor. Dr. Vasquez and I presented this scenario to analysis teams from both our species, asking them to predict the most likely successful negotiation strategies. Teams using traditional Zephyrian or human methods achieved success rates of approximately 67%. Teams using our hybrid methodology achieved success rates of 91%. The silence that followed was profound.
Elena could see the three counselors exchanging glances, their skin colors shifting in patterns she couldn't interpret. You conducted controlled testing? High Counselor Vexanael Prime asked, her voice carrying a note of surprise. Extensive testing, Elena confirmed, stepping forward to support Thex Morvain's presentation.
We worked with diplomatic simulation teams from both our species, presenting them with scenarios that required cross-cultural problem solving. The hybrid approach consistently outperformed traditional methods. But, more importantly, Thex Morvain added, his confidence growing with each word, the hybrid approach produced solutions that neither species would have discovered alone. By combining Zephyrian logical analysis with human emotional insight, we identified possibilities that were invisible to either methodology in isolation. The third counselor leaned forward, his skin displaying what Elena hoped was interest rather than hostility.
Can you provide additional examples?
Certainly, the scholar replied, loading a new set of displays. This narrative explores resource allocation during crisis scenarios. Traditional Zephyrian analysis recommends distributing resources based on logical priority matrices, maximizing overall survival rates. Traditional human analysis focuses on protecting the most vulnerable populations, prioritizing emotional and ethical considerations.
And your hybrid approach? High Counselor Vexanael Prime asked.
Discovers that emotional considerations can provide crucial data for logical optimization, Thex Morvain explained. In our testing scenarios, crisis response teams that ignored emotional factors consistently failed to account for psychological resilience variables, leading to secondary crisis cascades that undermined their logical optimization. Teams that balanced logical efficiency with emotional insight achieved superior outcomes in both individual and collective survival rates. Elena watched the counselors' expressions carefully, trying to gauge their reaction. Their skin colors were cycling through patterns she didn't recognize, but their posture suggested they were seriously considering the scholar's arguments.
Scholar Thex Morvain, the second counselor said slowly, are you suggesting that emotional analysis can enhance logical efficiency?
I am suggesting that the distinction between emotional and logical analysis may be less meaningful than we have traditionally believed, the scholar replied.
What humans call emotional insight often involves rapid processing of complex social and psychological data that formal logical analysis might miss or dismiss as irrelevant. And what Zephyrians call logical optimization often involves intuitive pattern recognition and value prioritization that humans would recognize as deeply emotional processes, Elena added.
We think we're using completely different approaches, but we're actually using different aspects of the same underlying cognitive processes. High Counselor Vexanael Prime was quiet for a long moment, her large eyes scanning through the data displays that surrounded them.
Scholar, these results suggest significant potential for improving Zephyrian analytical methodologies.
However, they also suggest that your cognitive patterns have been permanently altered by exposure to human thinking.
Thex Morvain nodded calmly.
That is correct, High Counselor.
I can no longer think in purely traditional Zephyrian patterns. However, I would argue that this represents an enhancement rather than a contamination.
How so? Because I can now solve problems that pure Zephyrian analysis cannot solve, while retaining all of my previous analytical capabilities, the scholar explained.
I have not lost anything. I have only gained additional tools for understanding and optimizing complex systems.
Elena felt her heart racing as she watched the exchange. Everything depended on whether the High Council could accept that change didn't necessarily mean loss, that growth could be beneficial even when it was unexpected. High Counselor, Elena spoke up, knowing she might be overstepping but, feeling compelled to speak. Scholar Thex Morvain hasn't become less Zephyrian.
He's become more Zephyrian than ever before.
He's pursuing the fundamental Zephyrian value of optimal solutions, but he's expanded his definition of what optimal means.
Explain, the High Counselor commanded. Traditional Zephyrian analysis defines optimal as maximum efficiency within known parameters, Elena said, her words coming faster as her excitement grew. But, Scholar Thex Morvain has learned to optimize across previously unknown parameters. He's not abandoning Zephyrian values. He's applying them more comprehensively than ever before.
Thex Morvain's skin brightened to a warm gold as he picked up Elena's argument. High Counselor, cosmic harmony is enhanced rather than diminished when we understand and incorporate previously unknown variables. My ability to think like a human allows me to optimize for human psychological and social factors that traditional Zephyrian analysis treats as external constraints rather than internal variables.
And this produces demonstrably superior outcomes, Elena added. Which means that Scholar Thex Morvain's approach is not just different from traditional Zephyrian methods. It's actually more Zephyrian than traditional Zephyrian methods, because it achieves better optimization results.
The silence that followed was the longest yet. Elena could see the three counselors processing this argument, their skin colors shifting through complex patterns that suggested intense internal debate.
Finally, High Counselor Vexinael Prime spoke.
Scholar Thex Morvain, if your hybrid methodology is indeed superior to traditional approaches, then logic dictates that it should be adopted more broadly.
Are you prepared to develop training protocols that could teach other Zephyrian scholars to incorporate human cognitive patterns into their analytical work? Elena saw Thex Morvain's skin cycle through surprise, excitement, and something that looked like hope. High Counselor, I would be honored to develop such protocols. However, effective training would require ongoing collaboration with human partners to ensure accurate transmission of human cognitive patterns.
You're suggesting permanent expansion of the cultural exchange program? The third counselor asked. I'm suggesting that optimal analytical methodology may require permanent integration of human and Zephyrian approaches, the scholar replied. Not replacement of our traditions, but enhancement of them through comprehensive understanding of alternative cognitive strategies.
High Counselor Vexinael Prime looked at Elena. Dr.
Vasquez, would your species be interested in such an expanded collaboration? Elena felt a surge of excitement so strong it almost made her dizzy. High Counselor, I think our species would be deeply honored to participate in such collaboration. Learning to think like Zephyrians could enhance human analytical capabilities just as much as learning to think like humans has enhanced Scholar Thex Morvain's. Then, perhaps, the High Counselor said, her skin shifting to what Elena hoped was an approving color, we should explore the possibility that cognitive diversity produces superior optimization outcomes. High Counselor, Thex Morvain said, his voice filled with quiet joy, I believe that exploration would produce fascinating results.
Scholar, the High Counselor replied, I believe you may be correct.
Dr. Vasquez, your cultural exchange program is hereby expanded to permanent status, with full council authorization to develop hybrid analytical methodologies for implementation across Zephyrian academic institutions. Elena felt tears of relief and excitement beginning to form in her eyes.
Thank you, High Counselor. You won't regret this decision.
I certainly hope not, the High Counselor replied, but Elena thought she detected the faintest hint of what might have been humor in her voice.
Scholar Thex Morvain, you will submit regular reports on your methodology development.
However, cognitive realignment procedures are hereby suspended indefinitely. Thank you, High Counselor, the scholar said, his skin now glowing with such bright golden light that Elena had to blink to look at him directly. I will not disappoint your trust in this new approach. As the three counselors prepared to leave, High Counselor Vexinael Prime paused at the entrance to the library.
Scholar, Dr. Vasquez, one final question. In your professional opinion, what is the most significant insight you have gained from this collaboration?
Elena and Thex Morvain exchanged glances, and Elena could see that the scholar was thinking the same thing she was. High Counselor, Thex Morvain said, I believe the most significant insight is that differences in thinking are not obstacles to understanding.
They are opportunities for discovery. The goal isn't to make everyone think the same way, Elena added. The goal is to help everyone think in more ways. High Counselor Vexenal Prime nodded slowly.
Scholar, Dr. Vasquez, I believe your collaboration may have implications far beyond literature and cultural analysis.
Continue your work.
After the counselors left, Elena and Thexmorvain stood in the library surrounded by their chaotic displays and scattered notes, both of them still somewhat stunned by what had just happened.
Scholar, Elena said finally, I think we just changed the course of interstellar relations.
Dr. Vasquez, the scholar replied, his skin cycling through every color Elena had ever seen him display, I think you're holding that conclusion backwards.
Elena looked at him in confusion. What do you mean?
Thexmorvain's expression shifted into what Elena was absolutely certain was a grin, despite the fact that Zephyrian facial anatomy shouldn't have been capable of such an expression.
I think interstellar relations just changed us.